one that we wouldn't recommend. Well, we don't recommend any trades.
Okay,
So,
these are
to your answer,
that's
how
the
does it
type
end?
of
What does it
audio
mean? Well,
data.
one of the points that we write about in the piece is that there's no.
Muted for now. So I got a couple things to talk about today. Now, I've been saying for some time, as long ago as maybe last year, that while the fiscal spending in 2020, the quote money printing, if you want to call it that, was essential to the inflation we saw about a year later in 2021, starting in February. Um, there's a much deeper issue, a systemic issue, and I have put this in another video, and that would be this right here: productivity growth. Now, I've highlighted this several times. The supply crisis didn't start during the lockdowns. Now, the lockdowns basically exposed the vulnerabilities of the global supply network and the specifically the United States supply network, which is too reliant on imports, and that really reared its ugly head in 2020, 2021 because of the absolutely stupid decision of locking down an entire economy in order to prevent a highly contagious single strand RNA virus that is highly adaptable, highly mutatable from spreading. An airborne virus, by the way. That is something that even the ancient Athenians during the plague of Athens understood couldn't be effective. Okay. But so because of those lockdowns, we had the supply crisis. But there's an underlying issue. Okay. All the supply crisis did was destroy the just in time delivery network that had existed for some time, that had kept prices of goods, especially, and as a result, services as well, low. But as I've shown many times here, if we go to the, let's go to 20 years, and you can see in the 2010s that productivity growth, and this is probably our best measure of economic output. Productivity growth was stagnant throughout the 2010s. Compare the 2010s. Hate when I do that. Compare the 2010s to any other period in history. As you can see, I'm scrolling back a few decades here and there. Productivity growth in the 2010s was quite pathetic. That is the amounts of goods and services that our economy is producing. So it follows that less goods and services being produced per person, but more people, or slightly more people. I mean, population growth in the United States isn't necessarily explosive, but if you include immigration, it probably is decent. So you have less goods and services being produced, more people, and then you add the money supply, M2 money supply, the fiscal spending of 2020, and you have a big problem. Now, why didn't we have the inflation for this first for most of the 2010s? If productivity was so bad, why didn't we see inflation in 2010 or 2015 or 2020? Well, truth of the matter is we did have little spots of inflation here and there in the 2010s, but we were able to keep the just-in-time inventory network going, and that kept the inflation relatively low. Add that to the technological, coefficient, and then add to that the debt coefficient because debt continued to rise. That keeps spending lower, that keeps economic activity lower, and that keeps inflation lower. But then in 2020, we had the unfortunate, ill advised decision to lock down the entire world, really, and put a serious damper on global trade. And this was enough to disrupt the top. Imagine a spinning top. The top is spinning because it's perfectly balanced. It has enough centrifugal force to keep it going. When we lock down the economy, it's kind of like someone putting their finger on the top, on the top somewhere lightly and disrupting it, and it starts to wobble, and it doesn't last long, and it falls down. We had that situation going. But my point here is that, I was watching Real Vision, the guy Darius, it's on Real Vision all the time. He's a very good analytical macroeconomist, very good. And he says, can the Fed, I guess he's asked the question, can the Fed do anything about inflation? He said, sure, the Fed can put us into a recession and that would take care of inflation. And I agree, it would take care of inflation temporarily. But the systemic issue causing the low productivity and the fact that the global supply network isn't going to reform like it was in the 2010s or ever before that. So you have those two factors. It would only stop inflation temporarily once the economy got going again, assuming that the government would continue, that the electorate would turn to government-focused solutions to government-created problems. We would see inflation pick up again, maybe worse, after a brief interlude. Now, I'm looking for this correlation because I just know in my heart of hearts, okay, as a devout libertarian, anarchist, whatever you want to call me, I just know in my heart of hearts that there has to be a correlation, okay, between this low productivity and this and expansion of government. And it took a minute, but I found one so far, and I'm going to be looking for more, no doubt. Here we have regulatory restrictions from the Federal Reserve before and after Dodd-Frank, a chart put together by George Mason University. This is a good, D.C. area university. They're not going to generally, because most of these people are statists, they're probably proud of this graph. So here we see the regulatory burden on banking mostly, because the Dodd-Frank Act and the Federal Reserve mostly deals with banking, but that is obviously the crux of the economy. That's where the money comes from. That's who holds the money. That's who lends the money. Ultimately, you see Dodd-Frank passed in 2010, and then you see regulatory restrictions from the Federal Reserve before and after Dodd-Frank go up until 2014. And I'm sure it might have leveled off, but I'm sure it continues to go up somewhat because making the regulations go down, maybe Trump managed to get some, I don't know. But I think it makes the point right here. You see a correlation between the Dodd-Frank Act, the rise and notice this graph goes all the way back to 1990, by the way. That's significant because you see throughout the 90s, a very, very prosperous period, I might add, you see slow growth to no growth to even marginal declines in the regulatory restrictions coming out of the Federal Reserve. Here you see a little bump in the early 2020, in the early 2000s. What do we see here in the early 2000s? We see it start to stagnate starting in the late 2000s. Do we not? This is the gross domestic product right here, right? Yeah, that's not really as relevant. So we see, and then we see this big increase in these regulatory restrictions. Okay, and we see. Oh, let me not do that. I screwed it up. Not good with this. And then we see in the 2010s, if we go back and contextualize it, we see the stagnation of the 2010s. And this is critical here because this goes back to the Austrian economics idea that if you want to revitalize the economy, you don't increase government, you decrease government. Because the ultimate fundamental concept here is that a private actor seeking to make a profit will always be more efficient, they will produce more than a government which doesn't have the profit motive. In fact, the government, any government, has an anti profit motive. They want to operate at a loss because that justifies what? It justifies more spending, more expansion of government. So that's my take on that. The ultimate issue here, and people on Twitter are starting to get it, but they think it's just a temporary supply problem. See, the problem with the FinTwit people, most of them, is they see the supply problem, the supply crisis, whatever they want to call it, starting in 2020. Now, they are correct in that the decisions made in 2020 were extremely miscalculating. But they don't understand that the supply crisis began long before that. It had to do with the United States tooling to be a import-based economy using other countries like China for slave labor, essentially, and then not having to produce anything at home. So the domestic production goes to absolute shit. And that's why in 2020, when we see the global supply chains disrupted, we start to see purchasing power in the United States decline. And we start to see that in Europe for similar reasons. And we also see throughout the world inflation pick up because the dollar is the global reserve currency. Therefore, whatever happens to the United States dollar will affect other currencies since it is the global reserve currency. It's no wonder that countries like Saudi Arabia want to start trading their oil in other currencies other than the dollar. What made the dollar attractive was its stability. Now other countries are starting to see their own currencies have problems because of the U.S. dollar being the baseline of the world. So it's not to take away from the fiscal spending of 2020. That also had a lot to do with the spikes in inflation we saw. But the real problem is systemic in nature. It has to do with the fact that we have just cut off our noses to spite the global trade system, starting in 2020, then accelerating here in 2022 with the sanctions against Russia, which is engaging in an intra-Slavic conflict, which the United States has no business being involved in whatsoever. Despite the United States, as we know, never had any business, any strategic business in Ukraine other than in the interests of dominating the world. That was the real interest. The United States is really seeking to dominate the entire world. That's what Ukraine was all about. Russia being in the way of that plan to dominate the world. The United States, the people that are vested in the United States, everyone from the government workers to the MIC to the Jeff Bezoses of the world, to the Bill Gateses of the world. They want to see the United States dominate the world at the expense of other people around the world because they are vested in this system here. That's what Ukraine was all about. But it got worse. The global trade network got even more fractured because of that. So, regardless of what the Fed does, the ultimate thing here is regardless of what the Fed does. The Fed has already come out, Powell has already come out with his disclaimer, which is very, very prescient. And he said, we can't do anything about supply. That was his CYA right there. Now, Darius said today correctly, and this really was illuminating to me just to think about it for a second. Sure, the Fed can do something about inflation. He can put the economy into a recession just like Paul Volcker did. You know, but what happened in the 80s that was different was that in the 80s, if you go back far enough, these regulations here are going to go down during the 80s, I'm quite sure. If you look at, I think I saw total pages of regulations chart somewhere, and you see a big dip in the 80s. So that might have had something to do with the inflation normalizing, manufacturing, slowing its descent into oblivion, if not increasing a little bit at times. But raising interest rates, even if the Fed did the Peter Schiff solution and raised interest rates to 10% overnight, that would destroy the economy. Even Peter Schiff acknowledges that. But also, it doesn't take care of the systemic issue, which is too much government regulation causing stagnating productivity. In fact, I would be willing to guess that the government would propose new government solutions to these government-created problems, which the electorate, being as ignorant as it is, would happily accept. And that would make the supply situation worse. And Macron would have been proven right. The era of abundance truly would be over at that point. So that's where we're at. You know, I don't get into all the trading nonsense, but when it comes to macro, I think I got a good handle on this. Anyway, that's my little thing for now, and I am going to quit now because I have nothing else to say. I'm out.